Apple does not sell upgrades. It sells the fear of falling behind. In January 2024, millions of Americans opened their mailboxes to find a $92 check from Apple, a quiet, paper receipt for something that had already cost them far more. Years earlier, your iPhone had quietly gotten slower, right before a new model dropped. It felt like coincidence, but courts found otherwise. This was Batterygate. That sluggishness wasn't random. It was a trigger, and your brain read it as evidence. The phone is dying, an upgrade is necessary. Waiting feels irrational. The $92 check names the harm, but not the mechanism. The real transaction was cognitive. Your sense of urgency was manufactured before you ever walked into a store. Rewind to late 2017. iPhone 6 owners on Reddit started reporting something strange. Their phones felt sluggish overnight, right after an iOS update. One user ran benchmarks before and after the update. The CPU scores had dropped significantly. Not a glitch, a pattern. Apple confirmed it. They called it power management, throttling older batteries to prevent shutdowns. Technical truth, but users had never been told. The technical explanation was real. But the behavioral effect, millions quietly assuming their old phone was simply dying, that was something else entirely. A Reddit user in r/Apple broke it down clearly. The aging battery triggered a CPU slowdown, not to punish you, but to prevent shutdowns. The fix was a $79 battery replacement. But millions of people didn't know that. So their brain filed it under "something is being taken from me." Behavioral economists call this loss aversion. The pain of losing performance registers as roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining it back. Your brain didn't run a cost analysis. It ran a threat response. That's not irrationality. That's wiring. And wiring has a name. Keep the list visible. Your iPhone slows down. Apps stall. The screen stutters, and without even thinking about it, your brain has already decided this thing is broken. Here is the part that rewires everything. A $69 battery replacement would fully restore CPU performance. The throttling vanishes. The phone runs like new again. But the brain doesn't run a cost-benefit analysis. Once something is mentally filed as broken, it is gone. That category closes. That is not a tech problem. That is not an Apple problem. It is a wiring problem. And once you name it, you will catch yourself filing things as broken long before they are. And then it happened again. In 2021, a new lawsuit surfaced, this time targeting iOS 14. Same complaint, same pattern. Battery drain, slower speeds. According to the Reddit-documented lawsuit, iOS 14 users alleged the update deliberately lowered processing speeds and battery life, damaging devices they'd already paid for all over again. Here is the part that matters psychologically. Users updated willingly. The trust was still intact. The cycle kept finding them, not because they were careless, but because the decision felt automatic. That's the pattern worth naming, not the update. Loss aversion explains why you dread the cracked screen. But Bernstein analyst Tony Sacconaghi found the installed base was set to be 80% larger entering the iPhone 8 cycle, 80% more people eligible to upgrade. And millions chose the $1,200 option. Loss aversion protects you from pain. But a completely different cognitive engine drives you toward status, novelty, and the feeling of being current. So the real loop opens here. If avoiding loss did not stop the upgrade, what bias did? That answer lives in a force most people have never been handed a name for. Bernstein analyst Tony Sacconaghi ran the numbers on Apple's installed base entering the iPhone 8 cycle. and the figure stopped analysts cold. The user pool was nearly 80% larger than the previous upgrade cycle, per Business Insider's 2017 reporting on Sakanagi's Bernstein analysis. That means hundreds of millions of people running the same psychological script simultaneously. The scale isn't just a business story. It's a map of how many brains were running identical wiring and had no idea they were following a shared script, not a personal decision. Apple's upgrade program listed the iPhone 11 at just $35.33 a month. As CNBC reported in September 2019, that number was carefully chosen. iPhone 11 Pro, $49.91 per month. Pro Max, $54.08. Each tier priced just below the next psychological threshold. Never round, never alarming. Here's what that does to your brain. $35 feels like a streaming service. It slots into a mental category you already approved. The $1,000 total? It never forms. Psychologists call this unit bias. Your brain evaluates the unit you're shown, not the whole. Show someone $35, and $35 is the decision. The $849 quietly disappears. Behavioral economists have a name for what just happened to you. It's called payment decoupling, and it rewires how your brain assigns weight to a cost. When a large price gets sliced into small monthly fragments, it stops registering as a real expenditure. As CNBC reported in 2019, the iPhone upgrade program locked buyers into 12 mandatory payments of $35.33, totaling $423.96 before the second year even began. That's the wiring, not a trick. A gap between how your brain feels a number and what that number actually is. Recon Analytics ran a cross-country study on smartphone replacement, and what they found wasn't about desire or technology. It was about structure. The single biggest factor shortening the upgrade cycle wasn't a new camera or a faster chip. It was how the subsidy was structured around the purchase. For every $100 in subsidy, the average handset replacement window got measurably shorter. Not because people needed a new phone, but because the deal made waiting feel irrational. The math was never about the phone. It was about who designed the decision and how a number on a contract quietly became the clock on your wallet. The upgrade urge feels personal. But Recon Analytics found the real driver isn't desire. It's the financing structure quietly built around the device. When subsidies hid the true cost inside a contract, upgrade cycles shortened. Remove the subsidy, and suddenly, people held their phones far longer. This isn't one country's quirk. The effect was measurable across nations. Same human beings, different payment architecture, completely different behavior at scale. You weren't upgrading because you needed to. You were upgrading because the payment system made the decision feel free. That's the wiring, not the want. Your photos live in iCloud. Your texts are blue. Your watch barely functions without the phone in your pocket. None of that happened by accident. This is Trap 3, friction lock. The invisible cost of leaving that makes staying feel like a non-decision. The takeaway is to name the trigger before the cart grows. DOJ antitrust investigators examined exactly this. As reported by the New York Times in January 2024, they scrutinized how Apple Watch bonds to iPhone and how iMessage quietly walls out competitors. Behavioral economists call this the status quo bias. The brain counts switching costs as losses, and losses hit twice as hard as equivalent gains. In March 2024, the Department of Justice sued Apple, not for a single product, but for the ecosystem itself. The allegation? Integration had quietly become a trap. The suit argued the iPhone's astronomical valuation wasn't built on hardware alone. It was built on switching costs so high, leaving felt irrational, as reported by CNBC in 2024. That's the mechanism courts are debating. But your brain already settled it. Every iMessage thread, every shared photo album made exit feel like loss, not choice. Ecosystems don't just retain customers, they reshape decisions. The DOJ called it monopoly. Behavioral economists call it lock-in. The longer you own something, the more your brain inflates its value. Not because it got better, but because leaving now feels like a loss. Behavioral economists have a name for this: the endowment effect. Your brain charges a premium just to release what you already hold. Layer switching costs on top. The iMessages archived, the AirPods paired, and the DOJ noted Apple made that exit psychologically brutal by design. Apple didn't invent this wiring. It just built a product ecosystem perfectly shaped around it. The trap was never the phone. It was your own psychology of ownership. After the iPhone 17 event, Apple quietly updated its trade-in values. Reddit's r/Apple thread caught something most buyers never notice. The numbers told a story. Users noticed trade-in incentives drop sharply right around year 2. Not year 3, not year 4, year 2. Exactly when battery health starts to visibly decline. That timing is not accidental. The moment your battery hits 80% capacity, the threshold iOS flags, your upgrade itch intensifies. The discomfort of a fading battery and the shrinking trade-in value arrive together, not by coincidence. That pairing is the wiring behind the upgrade. Reddit users noticed something precise. Trade-in values spike exactly when battery degradation peaks, the moment your phone feels most broken, least yours. That timing isn't accidental. When your device feels like a liability, the trade-in offer arrives as relief. Loss aversion does the rest, quietly, automatically. You're not choosing to upgrade. You're escaping a feeling, the feeling of holding something that's declining. The offer calibrates to that exact psychological window. The target was never your wallet. It was the recurring moment when your old device feels worst, and a new one feels like the only rational escape. Then Q1 2026 arrived. Tim Cook stepped onto the earnings call and reported something even analysts hadn't modeled: a full 16% surge in Apple sales. But the headline number wasn't the real story. Cook announced an all-time record for upgraders in mainland China, the exact cohort the friction system was designed to hold. Double-digit growth from switchers arrived on top of that. People who once chose competitors crossed over, because the identity loop finally pulled them in, as reported by CNBC in January 2026. Here's the wiring underneath. The system didn't sell phones. It manufactured belonging. And belonging, once felt, is not a decision your wallet makes. Loss aversion whispers your phone is broken. Payment decoupling shrinks $1,200 to $35. Ecosystem lock-in makes escape feel costly. 4 scripts, stacked in sequence. Apple's annual product cycle, documented in its 2017 SEC 10K filing, wasn't accidental. None of these scripts operate in isolation. Each one hands off to the next. Loss aversion to decoupling, decoupling to lock-in, lock-in to the trade-in window. The upgrade was never really about the phone. It was about 4 recurring decisions you never knew you were making. Now you have a name for each one. Here is where most finance content stops cold. Apple is manipulating you, so be stronger. That framing feels satisfying. It gives you a villain and a solution, but that framing is itself the trap. It assumes the entire problem is discipline, and discipline is the wrong diagnosis. Completely, measurably wrong. A Reddit user in r/Apple wrote that even after fully understanding the throttling mechanism, every detail, the upgrade urge fired anyway. That is the recognition worth sitting with. The wiring doesn't care what you know. It runs underneath knowing. Your brain doesn't experience your phone as a tool. It experiences it as an extension of you, part of your body's reach into the world. So when Apple's 2017 throttling slowed millions of iPhones, owners didn't think aging battery. They felt it. A small, repeated loss happening to them personally. Psychologists call this the extended self, the objects we merge with emotionally. When they degrade, the brain registers it as personal deterioration, not product failure. That stutter wasn't the phone breaking down. It was you feeling diminished. That's the wiring. And once you name it, you can't unfeel it. You don't decide to buy a new phone. You decide to stop the low-grade ache of watching your current one fall behind. And the upgrade is just the off switch. That feeling has a name: loss aversion relief. The brain weighs the small, ongoing loss as more painful than the large upfront cost. Apple's upgrade program locks that relief in. As CNBC reported, you pay $423.96 before any trade-in window even opens. 12 months of commitment baked into the very structure of the relief. The phone is packaging. What you actually purchased was relief from a feeling Apple helped engineer in the first place. Here's the real recognition. You were never asking, should I upgrade? You were asking, what loss am I trying to neutralize right now? The DOJ's 2024 antitrust case noted the integrated ecosystem itself creates behavioral lock-in. It's engineered to make leaving feel like loss, not choice. That's the wiring. Loss aversion doesn't ask whether the upgrade is worth it. It just fires the moment leaving feels like surrendering something you already own. When you ask the actual question, what loss am I neutralizing? And does this purchase actually neutralize it? The answer tends to change on its own. Every time. Apple didn't trick you. They built something genuinely desirable and then engineered the exact psychological conditions that make resisting it feel irrational. Apple's Q1 2026 earnings confirmed record upgraders, even in mainland China. The upgrade cycle isn't a side effect of great products. It is the revenue engine. Both things are true at once: a beautiful product and a system calibrated to trigger predictable human responses. No villain required, just wiring meeting design. The question was never, are you weak? It was, do you now have a name for what happened inside you? And does naming it change anything? In 2024, millions of iPhone owners received checks for $92, the Batterygate settlement. But the upgrade decisions those checks referenced? Already made. Years earlier. That's the architecture at its most complete. When upgrading becomes the default, automatic, emotionally preloaded, there is no moment where you actually choose. The patterns that drain you the most are the ones that never feel like decisions at all. No friction, no deliberation, just a familiar pull. And then it's done. The target was never your wallet. It was the absence of a recurring decision. Recognition is the only thing the architecture cannot engineer around. And now you have a name for what was invisible. If this changed how you see money, subscribe for more wealth psychology stories.